This video is for AQA A-Level Economics and it's for paper 3 and it's going to look at the June 2023 paper and it's going to give you tips and techniques for the 10 marker on that paper 3. The 10 marker is very different to any question that you get across the other two papers, and the reason for that is because it's an assessed question but it's only worth 10 marks. The only other time you get to see a command term such as assess is on the 25 markers, and then suddenly in paper 3 you get this 10 marker. So what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at tips and techniques but based on last year's summer exam. So the question for last summer was, to what extent, if at all, the data suggests that the Sri Lankan economy is more economically developed than the economies of Bangladesh and Pakistan. So straight away you need to consider, okay, what's the key focus of the question? The key focus of the question is to do with economic development. So what we need to do is, when we're looking at the data, we need to use the data which should be used to measure development of an economy such as Sri Lanka. So economic development, what is it? Okay, so it refers to the improvement in the overall standard of living and the quality of life of the population. Now, economic development, it has different measurements, but it's very important to remember that economic development is not the same thing as economic growth. And if you just concentrate on economic growth and you get the measurements of economic growth instead of development, or your argument is based on growth instead of development, then you will not be hitting the key points in terms of what the examiner is looking for. So one of the key measurements for the AQA specification in terms of measuring economic development is the Human Development Index. So the first thing that we should be doing in this question and in this insert is looking at, okay, well, do they give us any information on the HDI? Or do they give us any information which relates to the HDI? Now, this year, it was a little bit sneaky because previous years, what they do is they direct you towards an extract, but they didn't actually do it with this one. So they included a lot of information and a lot of data. What we're going to do is we're going to be looking at some of the common mistakes that were made by students, and this was again across all cohorts. So first of all, as I was mentioning, absolutely fundamental, they actually do give you the HDI. They give you the Human Development Index for Sri Lanka, for Pakistan and Bangladesh. Now just remember that the closer you are to 1 with the HDI, the more developed you are. So as we can see here, Sri Lanka 0.782, and that's greater than Bangladesh and Pakistan. I mean, that's absolutely essential. That almost gives us the judgment. But we've been given a lot of other information, so it's worth considering that. And there is other ways of measuring development. So we can look at the Genuine Progress Index and other factors which might come into this. So even though we've got the HDI, we still need to consider all the other previous figures. So the HDI, why is it used to measure development? Well, first of all, it does bring in 3 key index measurements. So it looks at health, it looks at education, and it looks at income. So in terms of health, it looks at the life expectancy. And again, this data does actually give you that information as well. In terms of education, it looks at the mean and expected years of schooling. And again, this data gives you a bit more information on education. And this is one measurement that sometimes students get mixed up with. It measures the income, but it's GNI per capita. Okay, not GDP per capita, but GNI per capita. So that's worth remembering because sometimes that's a mistake that students make. So what mistakes were made on this paper? Well, first of all, as I mentioned before, it doesn't direct you towards the figures, and there's a lot of figures. There's 5 figures in this case study. More figures than other papers for the paper 3 series. But are they all relevant? I mean, there's 17 columns of data. You cannot be using all 17 in this paper. You haven't got the time to do so. And for a 10 marker, really, the maximum amount of time, unless you get extra time, is 15 minutes. And it's really important as when you're reading this data, you are almost annotating the data as you're reading it, and you're planning those calculations. But you cannot be using 17 columns of data. So what you need to do is you need to think about what should be used, because not only can you not use it all, but you shouldn't use it all. AQA do not expect you to use it all. So I'm going to show you figure 1 in a minute. Figure 1 just wasn't relevant. So the mark scheme acknowledges this, and for students who use figure 1, they tend to find that their mark was limited because of that. In figure 2, not all of figure 2 is relevant. I mean, so for example, if you've got real GDP, but you've also got real GDP per capita, what you need to be considering is, which one should I be using? Should I be using both, or what's the point? Should I be using real GDP? Well, what's the point when you've got real GDP per capita, which gives you more of a, I suppose, more accurate understanding of development because it looks at the population. So you need to make those decisions. So this was figure 1, and as you can see, it says population and population density. Now, if you're trying to make that link to development, it's just probably going to slow you down, and it's going to be counterproductive. It doesn't relate. It's going to be very difficult to make it relate. So just save your time and just leave it. If, for example, this summer, where they do direct you towards an extract, and you've got quite a lot of figures still, again, should you use all the figures? You should use all the figures that are relevant. That's the key. What is relevant? Population, not relevant. Population density, not really relevant. Other figures have more relevance. And even in those figures, is all the data relevant? Probably not. So, this was a common mistake that was made, first of all. So, I've got 2 examples of this. So, number 1, Sri Lanka's GDP per capita is this, which is higher than Bangladesh, which is this, and Pakistan, which is this, proving that Sri Lanka is more economically developed. Well, why does it? That's almost like a point that you get on the mark scheme, but the mark scheme is not. It's not providing that chains of reasoning because it doesn't have to. It's just giving you some ideas. You need to fully explain in terms of why is Sri Lanka more economically developed, if they've got a higher GDP per capita. I mean, what even is GDP per capita? Why is it useful for measuring development? And then you've got this one, and it might appear that they've put a little bit more information in, but still, all it says is this would show that Bangladesh is more economically developed since they are generating high GDP per capita. It still doesn't tell us anything. What's GDP per capita got to do with maybe, like, for example, the welfare and well-being of the population? You need to provide that reason. And also the use of data, it might suggest that it's better than the previous point that I've just made, but they've just done percentage changes between like 2 countries or 3 countries, and it doesn't really make sense. So think about how you're using the data. If you're doing percentage changes between years, that would probably make more sense, but between countries, it doesn't really work. So you could do it in terms of, okay, well, how much of as a percentage of Sri Lanka's GDP does Bangladesh make or Pakistan make? That would make more sense, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. So the first point here is just sourcing the data, so just saying simply what their GDP per capita is. The examiner's straight away going to think, well, it's very basic use of data. I mean, really, are they even using the data much? It's just sourcing the data. So remember, there is an expectation that you use the data, you manipulate the data, you place weight on the data. So this is a better one, okay? So Sri Lanka's GDP per capita means that on average, individuals have more income and purchasing power. This is because the country's higher value of output per head compared with Bangladesh. As a percentage of Sri Lanka's, Bangladesh is only 53% and Pakistan's 32%. So this should translate into Sri Lankan citizens having a higher average income to afford goods and services, which enhances their well-being. That provides more reasoning. That's more realistic. That's better use of data. That gives more subject knowledge in terms of what GDP per capita is and why it's appropriate for example, development. So this was the next figure, and what we had was, it's the next figure, it's figure 3, and it's got the Gini index. So another mistake that was made by students is understanding the score of the Gini index. So we can see here that Sri Lanka's is 39.3, whilst Pakistan and Bangladesh is 32.4 and 31.6. So what does that mean? Well, there's a lot of errors with the inequality data, so some students misunderstood what that meant, and it was almost as if they got a little bit, I suppose, confused with HDI. So HDI, the closest you are to 1, the more developed you are. But with the Gini index, the closer you are to that line of equality, which is 0, the more equal you are, and the less, in terms of income inequality, you experience. So again, if we go back to here, Pakistan's 31.6, which is close to zero. Sri Lanka's 39.3, which is further away from zero. So actually, the Gini index is not in favour of Sri Lanka in this aspect. So what it might suggest is they might have higher GDP per capita, but is it spread out amongst the population in terms of that income equality? Not as much. So the Gini index and income share highlights greater inequality, yet their poverty rates does suggest greater development. So there is a little bit of conflict between the data, but that's fine. You can share that. You can explain that. That's absolutely fine. That can help with evaluation. So this was figure 4 and figure 5. Like I said before, HDI in figure 5. And you might look at the labour force participation rate, you might look at the capital investment, you might look at the CO2, but you might also think, actually, I don't have time to do that. And you do have to make those choices. You just need to pick what you believe to be the most relevant and the most important to the arguments that you are making. And then figure 4, you've got life expectancy, infant mortality, mean years of schooling, adult literacy, and that kind of fits in quite nicely with the HDI. So, what's important with this 10 marker is that you offer a judgment. Those students who didn't offer a judgment would have it was impossible to get into level 3. And often, if they fail to give a judgment, they were probably at the low end of level 2 at best. Now, if you considered a limitation of the data, that is going to help you to get into level 3, which is the highest level on this question. But the limitation has to be convincing. And what I also saw is students were trying to offer as many limitations as possible, but actually you only need one convincing limitation to be able to get full marks. So instead of just trying to get as many limitations of the data as possible, as you can see, some of them just might not be valid and they might be really clutching at straws. What I would do, probably at the end of your answer, is probably just kind of like reflect on all the data, everything that you said, and think about, okay, well, what do I notice about the data? Is there any inconsistencies in the data? Is there anything that's missing from the data that would help me to make this judgment? So this is one that I saw quite regularly. Is one limitation of the data is that GDP per capita might not fully help us to understand development. All right, I mean, yeah, that is true, but then don't pick it. You've got I've already mentioned earlier, you've got 17 columns of data. If that's what you think, then you don't have to pick that point, and therefore it's not really considered as a convincing limitation. Students sometimes refer to lacking information on nominal and real terms for GDP per capita, but fail to acknowledge the impact on purchasing power. So again, when you are offering a limitation, make sure that you fully explain that limitation. It's not like a tick box exercise where it's like one line. You actually have to provide understanding as to why it's a limitation. So this is an example for you. So one limitation of the data for figure 2 is the lack of information, as it does not state whether GDP per capita is in nominal or real terms. If, for example, data is in nominal terms, Sri Lanka's GDP per capita could be inflated, meaning their average purchasing power could be in fact lower than Pakistan and Bangladesh. That's better. That gives more understanding as to whether that's a limitation or not. So this is the exemplar answer. Feel free to pause. This is my issue 1. Now remember, on the mark scheme, it's very descriptive to that level 3. And it asks you for 3 issues and then an evaluation. So this is issue 1. This is issue 2. You can see that use of data being used. This is issue 3. And this is my overall judgment. So my limitation of the data was in a previous point. Where you put your limitation of the data, it doesn't matter as long as it is one. So as long as you put it, and I'd signpost it to the examiner, one limitation of the data is this, and then the examiner can look out for it. But if it goes in your overall judgment, that's absolutely fine. If it goes in your paragraph 1, again, that's fine. The only thing that I would say is, if you put it in your first paragraph, it might be a risk, because you might want to just make sure that you check all the data. And if you do it in your first paragraph, you might have rushed it